Hi, and welcome back to Bibles for Breakfast. Let's dig right in and see how far we can get. There's only 6 chapters left, so we might just go ahead and finish. We're on chapter 8. Alexander let Natasha tell Uncle Vitelli all about the book. She would do a better job of getting him interested than Alexander ever could. Uncle Vitelli was sometimes too contrary for his own good. He would argue sometimes just to argue, it seemed. Let's have a look. Uncle Vitelli really sounded interested now. The Great Controversy, he slowly read. He thumbed through the book and began reading from a couple of chapters. This looks very interesting, he said after a few minutes. We love it, Natasha said. Here, let me read you a part we found really interesting. Natasha reached for the book. It's over here in the chapter about the Waldenses. She turned the pages quickly and then finally stopped and ran her finger down to a specific paragraph. It says here, behind the lofty bulwarks of the mountains, in all ages the refuge of the persecuted and oppressed, the Waldenses found a hiding place. Here the light of truth was kept burning amid the darkness of the Middle Ages. Here for 1,000 years, witnesses for the truth maintained the ancient faith. Waldenses, huh? So who were these people hiding from anyway? Uncle Vitelli asked. Church leaders, government politicians. Alexander grew serious. People who didn't believe exactly like they did. Uncle Vitelli looked over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses. That would be serious stuff. I mean, having to hide from everybody just so you could live like you wanted to? I'd hate it. Alexander frowned and lowered his voice. I think we've all been there. So now, where do you say you got this book? Well, actually, that's the most interesting part of all, Natasha beamed. A young book salesman brought us the books. He knows all about religious history, and he can quote long passages from his books. Natasha held up the other book Leonid had sold them. This book here is the oldest book in the world. It's called the Bible. Some of it was written 1,400 years B.C. Leonid read to us from this book, and it has some of the most incredible stories we've ever heard. Alexander joined in. Stories that defy the imagination, and they're all true. Leonid, huh? Uncle Vitelli reached for the Bible. That's right. He said that the Bible has lots of critics, but every year archaeological discoveries are made that prove more and more of the stories to be historically accurate. Like... Uncle Vitelli stared over the top of his horn-rimmed glasses again. Like a story about a worldwide flood. Noah's flood, they called it. Alexander stared at Uncle Vitelli. You'd like that one. It's at the beginning of a book called Genesis. It has to do with the scientific world and all. Here, we marked some of them. See for yourself. He opened the holy book and pointed to the chapters with the story. And there's a story about a man who could tell the future through dreams. Natasha leaned over Uncle Vitelli's shoulder. He helped save ancient Egypt and all the other Mediterranean countries from starvation. Uncle Vitelli flipped the pages of the Bible. I see you've marked all kinds of stories here. He paused and began to read. So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat. Uncle Vitelli paused as if deep in thought. Did that really happen? According to Leonid, the book salesman, it did. Uncle Vitelli turned over some more pages and began reading again. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be moved and the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. He closed the book and looked over the cover, still holding his finger in the spot where he had been reading. I've heard this book is on some kind of contraband list. He glanced at Natasha, and then Alexander. We thought of that, Alexander said slowly, but it's so interesting, and it doesn't really say anything against the USSR. The book doesn't even mention it. Uncle Vitelli shrugged. Looks good to me. He raised his eyebrows. I like the books. When you're done with them, send them on over. Chapter 9. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Not a cloud was in the sky as Alexander got up and prepared for the new day. While he put on his uniform for work, Natasha made their breakfast. It was a simple one that they ate nearly every day of the week, more kasha with sour cream on it and some potatoes. It was not a meal for a king, but it was what they could afford. Alexander would have liked some sausage to go with it, but sausage was expensive, and he didn't always know whether he could trust it. When they did eat it, Natasha usually had to recook it to make sure any bacteria or sickness in it was killed. Have some more potatoes, Natasha yawned sleepily. Watch out now, the pan is hot. They smell so good. Alexander reached for a second helping. Thank you, dear. She stared at her husband, handsome in his gray uniform. God is good, she smiled sweetly. I think our life has changed forever. Ever since Leonid's visit, it's like there is nothing that can go wrong. It is as if the peace of God is in our hearts, and nothing can take that away. She rubbed her eyes awake. That's exactly what I was thinking, Alexander patted Natasha on the cheek. It seems too good to be true, doesn't it? They read a few pages from their books, and then Alexander suddenly pushed himself back from the table. I'd better take the dogs for a short walk before I leave. Natasha got a startled look in her eye. That's right, I totally forgot about Boris and Lexi. They've been so quiet. We never let them out of the back room last night after Uncle Vitelli and Aunt Marina left. Get your coat, Alexander. I'll get them out right now. She hurried to the back room, talking to Alexander as she went. I thought it was odd that the dogs didn't wake me up this morning. Boris is no small dog. I hope he's been a good boy. He must be ready for a good run by now. Come, Boris. Here, Lexi, she called as she opened the door to the storeroom and turned on the light. And then Alexander heard her gasp. Oh, no, you naughty dogs, she half shrieked. Boris, what have you done? Oh, Alexander, she called in alarm. This is terrible. It cannot be. By now, Alexander had rushed to the back room to find Natasha standing speechless in the middle of the room. Boris was running about excitedly, his tail wagging, while Lexi looked up at Natasha with pleading eyes. Strewn everywhere were things that had been on some shelves in the storeroom. 2 or 3 dishes lay broken on the floor, and holes had been chewed in a warm winter coat. But the sight that most horrified Alexander and Natasha was the box of books that Leonid had left with them. The box had been knocked off a small table in the room and was on its side on the floor. Bibles and books had been dragged out by the dogs and scattered across the floor. Pages lay everywhere, torn from the wonderful books. Teeth marks scarred the pages and bindings, and some of the book covers were gnawed beyond recognition. This cannot be, Natasha moaned, sinking to her knees. The dogs have eaten the Bibles. They have chewed them to bits. Oh, Alexander, what will we do? Boris and Lexi tried to make their peace with Natasha, but she pushed them away. You naughty, naughty dogs. Don't you try and be all sweet now, she scolded them angrily. How could you have done this? I should give you a horrible spanking. We should never have left the dogs in here so long, Alexander groaned, his hand on his head and his shoulders sagging. We were talking and talking last night and forgot all about them. He closed his eyes in exasperation. Whatever will we say to Leonid? All his wonderful books, Natasha bowed her head in shame. Gone, destroyed. Look at the pages all ripped out, torn from the books and laying all around like this. And all the teeth marks. They look as if a wild animal has torn them to bits. Natasha's eyes finally softened a bit as she looked at Boris, his face a picture of innocence. Oh, Alexander, Boris didn't know he was doing wrong. He's just a puppy. But he ruined the books, and now we are going to have to pay for them. Alexander's eyes flashed angrily. You bad, bad dogs, he said coldly. Natasha glanced around her. How many books were in the box, Alexander? He sighed tiredly and knelt beside her. I don't know, Tosh. Let's see. It looks like this is part of one, and this piece here goes with it, and this must be another. He bent down, and here's another. 4, 7, 8. That could go with that one over there. 9, 10. Natasha began counting with him. 11, 12. Oh, Alexander, there must be a dozen books here, damaged. She covered her face with her hands. And these were God's books, ready to do so much good, to bring the gospel to many people in this big city. Alexander slowly rose to his feet, shaking his head dejectedly. What could they say? The ruined books had been promised to customers who had already paid for them. Now the people would have to wait even longer for their books. But the thing Alexander and Natasha feared the most was the look that they knew they would see on Leonid's face when they told him the sad news. He had been so good to them, to bring them the hope of a new life with God, and now this was how they were repaying him? Go ahead and take the dogs for their morning run, Natasha said sadly, still on her knees among the scattered pages and fragments of the books on the floor. I'll take care of this mess. The dogs scampered away at mention of a walk, suddenly oblivious to the carnage they had left behind. As Alexander walked the sidewalks through the local park, watching Boris and Lexi run playfully, he wished that he could be as carefree as them, but he knew it wasn't possible. The ruined books loomed before him like a giant, immovable mountain. Alexander picked up a stick and threw it for the dogs to chase. The last few hours had turned into a disaster, a catastrophe. Just the evening before, he and Natasha had been sharing with Uncle Vitelli and Aunt Marina the wonderful new books that had come to bless their lives. And now this. In all his years of living, he couldn't remember anything that had ever turned out quite so badly. It seemed a calamity of astronomical proportions. The books would cost an incredible amount of money to replace, but it was more than that. There was something more that was bothering him beyond the obvious. Maybe it was because of what the books represented. They were religious books, books that had a real purpose and had been prepared especially to take the good news of salvation to the world. The tragedy was almost sacrilegious in a strange sort of way, a desecration of something holy. He didn't know much about the history behind the books, how they had been written, or what it had taken to get them printed and smuggled into Novosibirsk. But one thing was sure, God himself was involved here. Alexander remembered Leonid's story about the lady who had prayed and how an angel appeared to her in a dream, telling her to look for a man with 2 books. In his dream, in his mind, that made them holy books. And were the rest of Leonid's books any less holy? Alexander thought not, and that made his situation all the more desperate. The thought that Boris and Lexi had chewed Leonid's books up, seemed worse than irreverence. It was like a slap in the face of God. Chapter 10. I must be strong, at least for Natasha, he reasoned as he walked back to the apartment, trying to shake off the tangle of thoughts that threatened to overrun him. He was very quiet when he stepped back into the warmth of their little apartment, but he had a determined look on his face. Don't worry, he assured Natasha. We'll think of a way to raise the money to pay for the books. Alexander and Natasha sat down on the kitchen table to ponder what they should do next. They looked through the box of books once again to survey the damage. Out of the 20-some books in the box, 14 of them were ruined beyond repair. Whatever will we say to Leonid? There were tears in Natasha's eyes. God sent him to us with such a wonderful message, and this is how we repay him? We will just have to pay for the books, that's all. Yes, of course, but they will cost so much. How can we ever find the money to do this? Alexander gave a deep, tired sigh. I don't know, Natasha, but we must. It's only right. The day had hardly begun, but already Natasha thought that he looked tired. She bowed her head in submission to the problem that they must face. Maybe you're right. God will help us. Alexander put his head in his hands. It was not really our fault. The devil was here to give us trouble. You think so? I'm sure of it. The devil does not want us to be happy. He doesn't want us to know about God or the truth from his holy Bible. Natasha's eyes grew wide as though she suddenly understood for the first time. So the devil is mad at us, and he made Boris do it. She turned to Boris, who sat looking at her warily. So that's it, Boris. Did you hear that? You should not have helped Satan destroy the good books, you naughty dog. Shame on you. She shook her finger at him and then glanced at the mother dog. And Lexi, you should have made your puppy behave. Well, what's done is done. Alexander shook his head grimly. We will just have to tell Leonid the truth when he comes. I just hope he understands. But God will have to help us, he added, if such a thing is possible. We cannot pay for the books now. God will have to help us somehow find the money for these books. He got up from the table, his coat still on. Now I must go to work. We must pray to God, Natasha, like Leonid did. Maybe God will help us find a way to pay for these books. We can talk about it tonight when I come home. Alexander left the apartment and made his way to the train station, where he boarded the train that would take him to the business district. He stared out the window of the slow-moving train. The click-clack of the wheels on the rails punctuated his thoughts as he passed by high-rise apartments, through darkened subway tunnels, and finally above the busy streets to the town's business section where he worked. What a dilemma he was in. Alexander closed his eyes and tried to think of a solution. The thought of all those books lying around torn to shreds was ominous. Was he going to pay for the books that the dogs ruined? He was a poor man. He mentally calculated how much the books would cost to replace, and the thought of such a thing seemed financially impossible. He had already given Leonid the money, all the money that he had in the house to pay for the 2 books they bought. That had been the money they needed to pay for food and medicine for the rest of the month. Alexander wouldn't receive his monthly salary for another 2 weeks. Fortunately, Alexander's job did not require him to concentrate much, because he was certainly doing a poor job of that this morning. The gated area where the vaults were located was a quiet, expansive room with little traffic most hours of the day. There was plenty of time to think about the whole trouble that he and Natasha had gotten themselves into. Maybe too much time. All morning, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had started their day. As he stood at his post by the bank vault, he tried to think of what he would do or say if he were in Leonid's shoes, listening to a customer tell him that the books that he had trusted to their care were ruined. He couldn't imagine the situation turning out very well. After all, was there really any good way to say, by the way, our dog ate your books? He tried praying, but his prayers seemed to go no higher than the ornately tiled ceiling stretched over him in the quietness of the bank antechambers. Finally, he bowed his head and laid his anxieties before God. I have no answers, he prayed. Lord, only you can help me get past this terrible disaster. Who knows, maybe there is even a reason you allowed such a thing to happen. Didn't I hear Leonid say once that everything always turns out for the best when you work for God? Alexander smiled inwardly, though his face betrayed him otherwise. Of course, such a thing couldn't be entirely true at face value, but something in his heart told him that he would rather be a poor man and have the peace of God than have things the other way around. Meanwhile, back in the apartment, Natasha was trying to put the torn and ragged pages back into the books, but it was no use. Most of the books were ruined beyond repair. Hundreds of pages were ripped and shredded and wet with dog drool, and the book covers were full of teeth marks. She felt terrible. As she looked at the hopeless mess, she knew there was absolutely nothing she could do. There was nothing anyone else could do, and there was no one to talk to about it either. Not that it would have mattered much. The whole thing was too depressing for words. Even Boris looked sad at the turn of events. All that day, Natasha thought about the Bibles and the books. Often she would stop her work to wipe the tears from her eyes. It's bad enough that the books are ruined, Natasha thought. Books are precious to the people of Russia. They're like old friends. Books are to be read and reread and then shared with others. But these books are God's books. They've been printed to bring the gospel to people searching for God. They were entrusted to us for safekeeping, and they were very expensive. What are we going to do about it? At one point during the morning, she literally fell to her knees and prayed tearfully, almost desperately, "Please, God, we didn't mean to ruin the books. We are so glad you sent Leonid to us, but we're just sick about the dogs tearing the books all up. Please help us to find a way for them." And then, almost as an afterthought, she stammered, "I don't really know you, God. Leonid says you are the God of the universe, and yet you care about us. Please, God, if you will, I know you can help us find a way." Somehow, praying seemed to help, though she had never really prayed alone before. Her prayers gave her courage to wipe the tears from her eyes and continue on with her work. And working helped some, forcing her mind to focus on other things. However, by the time Alexander came home that night, Natasha was exhausted from her long day of worrying and anxious prayer. Well, let's see. It's going to take a lot longer. So I guess I was wrong. We have one more day, and then we'll finish chapters 11, 12, and 13. So we will pause there, and tomorrow we will see what happens to Alexander and Natasha and the books. See you tomorrow.